So, let us get started. Thank you all again for coming on this chilly night. This is our fourth Budget 101 presentation, and Victor and I, believe it or not, have had some fun creating these. Fun is more in his kind of lane as financial information, because Victor loves pivot charts and things like that, as you probably can figure it out by now. He does a fine job with all of that. And so together, we try to make, this whole construction of a school budget something that's understandable and digestible. And obviously, Elena, as you know, who's Victor's partner in this, is also someone who's deeply involved and very helpful in this endeavor. So in tonight's presentation, as I said earlier, this is an effort to really provide some helpful information to our community about how a school budget is developed. As you know, and if you don't know already, there's not a whole lot that a school district actually has control over in terms of revenue. And if you have this newest infographic, you'll see, which will be a big part of this presentation tonight, that New York State controls 95% of school districts' revenue. And that 5% comes from, or is within the purview of the school district. So that's a pretty significant relationship, between the state of New York and an individual school district. So what we hope we can do is to really help define some of those, and we have our guest speaker, Mike, who can help us to look globally at some of these intricate components and perhaps leave you with a little more sort of clarity around some of these complexities, because it is complex. I want to thank Victor again for spending a lot of time in the development of this, but also he's created a process that will be usable in the future. So these 101s have been a really fine example of ways in which we can demystify some of the components of school budgeting, which is really difficult for the average person to understand unless you live in it and live in it as the business official. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Victor, and what we'll try to do is also to rewind back to last year's budget, where we did have to make some decisions, and I think part of this presentation will help you to understand some of those decisions and shed light on how we where we are in terms of moving forward. And certainly tonight's presentation is timely because the governor has released a lot of really important information that the districts need in order to construct their budgets. And even with that, it's still preliminary until final decisions are made in April. So it's a long time to kind of wait to get exact numbers that would help a school district to prepare and construct the best budget possible. So with that said, Victor, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Henning. And again, I am very proud of this work that we're undertaking here, because I think it's important to inform our community of the factors that are affecting our budget. Tonight we're going to be talking about state aid and tax levy, or the tax cap and other revenues. With us, assisting us tonight, is Mike Voss from Westar BOCES. Westar is a group of state aid planning specialists. Mike is a state aid planning specialist. And like the other 700 school districts in New York State, we need help analyzing the very complex state aid components that we're going to be discussing this evening. And I'll just ask Mike if you'd like to give a quick overview of Westar BOCES and their services.
Sure. And as Victor alluded to, so our service, state aid planning, we're a statewide service. We're typically a BOCES service. They just serve the component BOCES of their area. We're statewide, and we serve 650 districts. So basically, pretty much just about every district in the state. And a lot of it really is because, as Victor alluded to, the complexity of the state aid formulas, and it's really their calculations on a district-by-district basis. So that's primarily what we do. We interact with the business officials or superintendents of districts and go through these different pieces, particularly when the governor's budget comes out. We work to explain and look and see if there's errors. And so that's kind of, we serve and support districts that way. Some of the other things we look at, tax cap, we have help districts out with. But state aid is really our bread and butter. So that's like comes in.
We are so thankful, and you'll see how complex state aid is to understand. So just as an overview of what we'll be discussing tonight, As we discussed, state aid, as Dr. Henning mentioned, it's now in January. The governor has released the executive proposal. The governor has released the executive proposal beginning in February or sometime in February this month. The legislative branch will release their budget proposal, and then come April 1st, hopefully I say hopefully because there have been years in which the state failed to adopt a budget on time, which obviously left school districts scrambling, not knowing how much money they're going to get. So traditionally, the executive budget proposal comes in somewhat low. The legislative proposal comes in higher. They begin throughout the month of March, and the enacted budget comes in somewhere in the middle, hopefully closer to the legislative budget again, so that there's more revenue to the schools. Tax levy is the sum of taxes to be raised by the school district after subtracting all other revenues, including appropriated fund balance. Appropriated fund balance is use of our savings that help us offset our expenses and state aid. Other revenues, again, as Dr. Henning mentioned, represent a very small part of our budget. They include payments in lieu of taxes, which are arrangements between actually the Putnam County Industrial Development Agency and commercial businesses that negotiate a payment in lieu of a full property tax assessment. Interfund transfers, donations, interest, which fortunately has been increasing over the past year, and other non-recurring miscellaneous revenues. But again, these are very, very small in comparison to our tax levy, which is about 75% of our budget, and state aid, which is about 20%. Dr. Henning reviewed this infographic. Again, 95% is practically controlled by the state through the tax cap formula and the state aid allocation. We have very limited ability to control our revenue budget with just 5%. These other two charts are too small to see here, but we'll review them in greater detail. So state aid, we talk about state aid in general, but there's actually six major categories. Foundation aid, which is represented by this light blue bar. Excess cost aid, which is this darker blue or purple bar. Building aid is the yellow bar. Transportation aid in green. BOCES aid in magenta, and Instructional Materials is this very small aqua color. So again, foundation aid makes up the lion's share of our state budget. We'll talk about all the factors that are used in each of these different state aid types. So this cartoon is a pretty accurate depiction of these state aid formulas. It's very complex. In some cases, these formulas have over 180 lines in the calculation, which again is another reason why there are 650 school districts in New York State that utilize the services of Westar BOCES to help school districts sort through this. So we'll start with foundation aid again, which makes up the majority of our state aid budget. The major factors that go into the foundation aid formula, one is the adjusted gross income of Brewster Central School District residents. And that's reported to the New York State Education Department from the New York State Department of Tax and Finance. So about this time, when you're completing your New York State income tax returns, and there's that little checkbox that asks for the school district code, that's the purpose of that school district code, because it's calculating the adjusted gross incomes of all of the residents in each of the school districts throughout New York State for purposes of allocating foundation aid. Property tax value is another major component. It's reported by the assessors of each of the municipalities within the school district. For Brewster schools, we have Southeast, Patterson, and a tiny portion of Carmel. Total square miles, poverty count, which is derived from U.S. Census data, and Mike, the U.S. Census data that's used in this calculation is it 2010?
2000.
From 2000, so nearly 18-year-old data is used to come up with the major component of our state aid. So clearly that information is out of date, being 18 years ago, but this is one of the limitations of the state aid formula.
And that's for every county. That's just how it works.
That's for every
state.
school district. Every school district in New York State is subject to the same constraints and the same limitations of the census data. So you see here there are 94 lines in this calculation for foundation aid. And Mike, just giving a little anecdotal information, the state calculated a foundation aid formula, but then fails to implement it. Is that right?
Right, so a little history of the foundation aid. What it comes out of in the 1990s, there was a lawsuit by parents of New York City school children. And they sued the state of New York, and they said, basically, New York was not providing enough money to support their kids. And it goes, in the state constitution, it says that the state must provide for a sound basic education. So that court case called the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, it went through the courts for over a decade. And after it went through all the courts, the appellate courts, the Supreme Court, the courts found that New York State was at fault. They were not supplying enough money for the kids. And so really what came out of it was the foundation aid as a response, but it wasn't just directed towards New York City kids, it was all kids in New York City. And so the premise was that they were, New York, as we know, is a very political state. And the idea was that this was going to be a formula that would be really apolitical. So it's not influenced by politics, but it would drive towards need. So it would take into account factors like the ability of a community to support education, the wealth of the community, both through property wealth and through income wealth. It would take a look at the need of the students, as Victor mentioned, the poverty counts, free and reduced price lunch counts, English language learner counts, and then also the idea of what it actually costs. So using weighted pupil counts. So for instance, a student with disabilities, it costs more to educate them. So we take into account the needs of the district to pay. And so in theory, all of these different pieces were going to go into the calculation every year, and it was going to reflect and push the need towards where it needed to go. But the bottom line was, New York State, they did a cost analysis, and they said, what does it cost to educate a kid successfully? And when they implemented it, they couldn't afford it. So they were going to phase it in over 3 years, but they started in 2007. Well, then the recession, so then the state really couldn't afford it. So the bottom line is they froze the formula, and then what we've seen every year, well, for a number of years there was no increase, but now what we've seen and what the governor's proposed in this budget is they take your prior year, and then they set just a number of tiers. So in this case, there's 4 tiers, and then that's your increase. So what's happened is this formula that was supposed to be not involved in politics, now it's largely become a very political thing. And so as a result, where Brewster stands right now is about $4 million underfunded for the current year of what you would be receiving if the foundation didn't go down. And so just one more point, we deal with districts throughout the state, and you're in this scenario. Some districts are really in the hole where they would be owed a lot more, but about 30% of the districts are overfunded. So it's really out of whack from what it was originally intended. So that's kind of where we are right now.
So now it becomes even more political because those 30% of districts that are actually overfunded because of the formula, they don't want to see any change to this because they're getting more than the state's formula said that they should. So it's almost ironic that the state has a formula for foundation aid, realized that they couldn't actually implement this formula, so they then came up with another formula to figure out what they could afford. But bottom line is, Brewster Central School District is being shortchanged by the state by about $4.7 million each year for the state's failure to implement the foundation aid.
And if we could get that money back, it would be somewhere in the neighborhood of about $22 million.
Over the course
of the time, of full time in which this process was set in place.
So the next category here is excess cost aid. And excess cost aid is state aid to districts for the cost to educate students with disabilities. And the reason why it's called excess cost aid is because the district is responsible for picking up the basic share, and the state will then reimburse for the excess cost in addition to the basic share. So there are 2 components here. There's private excess cost aid for our students who are attending private school placements, also public excess cost aid for our students who are attending other public schools or BOCES. And of course, there are certain exclusions. So again, there is a basic share that the school district is required to pick up, and the state will then reimburse for the excess cost on top of that. Of course, going into this category, it includes tuition counts. So we have another acronym that you may have heard, STAC, System to Track and Account for Children, and that's our mechanism for reimbursing or requesting reimbursement from New York State. And there are 25 lines in this calculation.
Yep. classifying kids, and they constantly add us, I think, because we had over, because we do it right. And so, if I'm not mistaken, I remember hearing that, and is that correct?
There is, but it doesn't factor into our state aid. So that's an impact that they'll cite us, and they'll say that, you know, we have a disproportionately high population of students with disabilities.
Right.
But that's a different you know, metric that they're measuring us. We don't receive any deduct in state aid because of that.
That's what I was, my question.
Yep.
I would add too that these are particularly high-cost students. So these are your most disabled students.
I know.
You know, the kids that you can't educate in-house because their needs are so great. So we do get aid through the foundation aid for students with disability because of their rating. This would be in addition because the students are so costly.
I have a question. Did anybody consider suing the state, all these school districts that are unfunded in recent years? Have they?
There are actually several lawsuits there.
Okay, I just curious.
Yeah.
I think one was small cities. See, particularly what we're seeing is the neediest districts tend to be the ones that are most short-funded. So the small cities, they banded together and had a lawsuit. I think one of the lawsuits was struck down. I don't know what I think it was more of a procedural thing, but I think there are a couple other pending lawsuits. So and there's a little change in the politics right now with the state senate, but this has been a big push, both in the assembly and the senate to fund foundation. The governor says he has no obligation, that was made under a prior governor. So we see a little conflict, but that's certainly, I think there's a political movement to fund.
Next category is building aid. So we've been completing our capital improvement project district-wide. There are allowable construction project costs, and then there are not allowable costs, and I'll talk about some of the non-allowable project costs. So the state basically has a mechanism to prevent a school district from building a $2 billion elementary school. So, you know, of course, the state will provide funding for up to maximum cost amount, and that's again determined by the state. The reimbursement is spread out over the life of the project. So if it's a renovation project, it's typically 10 to 15 years. If it's a new building, if it's a new space, it's typically 20 years. It also takes into consideration pupil capacity of the new or renovated space. So if you have significantly declining enrollment, the state will not reimburse you for the construction of a new school building. Statewide average interest rates also factor into this category. So for every school district in New York State who has debt, who has construction debt, is required to report the interest rate that they're paying to New York State. The state takes the average of all those interest rates throughout the state and uses that in their calculation, and that incentivizes those districts who are paying high interest on construction debt to then refinance that debt to a lower amount to get within or under the statewide average interest. And again, there are 48 lines in this calculation. Any questions with building aid? Transportation aid is based on obviously our operational costs here, transporting our students to and from school. There are allowable operational costs, and then there are non-allowable operational costs. And one of the major non-allowable costs are transportation costs for students who reside within 2 or 3 miles of school, depending on their grade span. So students in grades, I want to say K through 8, who live within 2 miles of the school district are not eligible for state aid reimbursement for transportation aid. So the state's rules on transportation is that local school districts are not required to provide transportation for any students who reside within 2 miles of the school if they're in grades K through 8. If they're in high school, the state says that you're not required to transport students who live within 3 miles. Most school districts do, and that's usually done through a resolution many years ago, or sometimes in the absence of a resolution, it's just been the district's practice since the inception of time to provide transportation for all students. Brewster transports all students, and therefore we have non-allowable limits for those students who are transporting, who live within these limitations of the school buildings. Of course, total square miles comes into play, and bus purchases. So we talk about our Proposition 2 for our fleet replacement plan. This is the aid category that reimburses us for purchases of school buses. And this is probably the longest calculation of them all. 188 lines in the calculation of our transportation aid. Does anyone have any questions with regard to transportation?
I have a question. Are there any exemptions for non-allowable if there's no public transportation? Because even if kids wanted to, there's no buses here. So is there any exemptions at all for that?
There aren't. And there are different rules between city school districts and central or union-free school districts. In city school districts, transportation is not required at all. And there are a lot of city school districts that do not provide transportation. Again, it's up to the local school district to adopt a resolution to declare, okay, we are going to transport, even though the state says that we don't have to. So, a lot of times there would be challenges and say, well, I have to cross over railroad tracks to get to school, even though it's only a mile away from my home. The commissioners ruled that it doesn't matter as long as what rules is limits. But again, this isn't applicable to Brewster because we transport all students, whether you live, 500 feet of a school building, we transport. So BOCES aid is based on our allowable BOCES costs, and I talk about the non-allowable costs. So, and BOCES, just as a recap, BOCES is an acronym for Board of Cooperative Educational Services. We often talk about COSERs or co-service agreements, and BOCES is basically the state's original shared service program, because if not for BOCES, local school districts wouldn't be able to provide a lot of the services that they're able to provide to our students, and most notably our career and technical education. So most districts don't have the financing or the operational capacity to offer a career and technical education program, but by virtue of the Northern Westchester BOCES, they provide that program not just for Brewster students, but Carmel students, Mahopac, and all the other component districts that we're able to educate our kids for career and tech programs, as well as a number of other services that they provide. So BOCES is very, very valuable to school districts because of those shared service arrangements, and being able to be reimbursed by the state for up to 67.5% of those aidable costs makes it very, very important for school districts to continue those shared service arrangements. I'm going to kick it over to Mike, because within the governor's proposal is an idea. It's not a very well thought out idea, in my opinion, for the state to collapse most of these aid categories into one aid category. And I'll ask Mike to give a better explanation of what's going on.
Sure. So transportation aid, BOCES aid would be what you consider expense-based aids. You spend it in 1 year, you get aided on it in the following. And so what the governor's proposing is he's proposing taking 11 different aid categories. Really, transportation aid and BOCES aid are probably the two biggest, just from a dollar figure. But he's proposing to collapse these all and call it service aid. And so under his plan, they would essentially take whatever you spent the prior year, and that would be your base. And then from then on, it would only could increase by CPI plus a weighted enrollment count. So essentially what that's saying, if your enrollment is flat or declining, you're really going to be stuck. You're not going to really get much of an increase at all. So he's really trying to rein in aid on these expense-based categories. And largely the governor's rationale for it is that under this governor, he's kept state spending and the state agencies to 2%. Education and healthcare have exceeded. So the governor's trying to rein in education spending. Also, we have people that are making an argument for foundation aid, because districts are being short of foundation aid. So the governor's trying to find somewhere to get it. But he's going to try to do it at the expense of these expense-based aids, which is very different as far as kind of how districts have approached things. And Victor was talking about the different areas for transportation aid. But the bottom line is you're still going to be required to transport those kids every year. In addition, any private school kids that you have that are in a private, parentally placed private school, you're required to transport them. So you're going to have the expenses, but now you're going to be aided at a really diminishing rate going forward. So it's a big deal. And as Victor pointed out, BOCES the whole idea of BOCES are shared services. Brewster can't do everything itself, but with neighboring districts, it makes sense to have some of these programs because you can share the cost. And this governor's been very big about sharing services. So it's really kind of flies in the face of what he's been saying year after year if he's going to look to cut this category in particular. So it's a budget proposal, and I think what's important to realize it's a budget negotiation. So this was a piece that he stood as far as negotiation. Whether this actually comes to fruition remains to be seen.
Right. And it's counterintuitive to the purpose of a BOCES and shared services. So, he's proposed things in the past and they haven't come to fruition. My gut is that this isn't going to come to fruition, but nevertheless, he proposed it. Finally, we have does anyone have any other questions on BOCES aid? Instructional materials aid is very simply an allocation per pupil for the following categories: hardware and technology, software, library materials, and textbook aid is easily $58 per student. And each of these allocations is then multiplied by our enrollment to come up with our instructional materials aid. So if we look over just the past 4 years, and this extends way beyond that, but just over the past 4 years, this is a comparison of our state aid projection based on what the governor's output report shows in January, and then what the enacted budget will show in April, compared to the amount that we actually receive. So this light blue bar shows the state aid projection from the state's perspective. The dark blue shows the amount that we actually receive. And you can see over the past 4 years, we've received on average $400,000 less than what the state says that we're going to get. And the reason for that is the state is basing their projection on their worst case scenario of what they may have to pay us based on certain assumptions that they make based on building completion, building project completion, and other things. So on average, we've received about $400,000 less than the governor's proposal or the enacted state budget. So for the purpose of this presentation, I just really want to stress, if anyone's looking at the newspaper article or the actual output report from the executive budget or enacted budget, I caution you to pause, because a lot of reconciliation goes into finding out what we're actually going to get. And again, that's why we utilize Westar BOCES. We're in the process right now of reconciling the 1920 amount that the governor says that we're going to get, when the reality is we know that we're not going to get that same amount. So again, I use caution when looking at a newspaper article that's just simply grabbing a number, or if you take the time to look it up on your own. Does anyone have any questions?
Just one question. Proposed from the governor, it seemed our increases were more on the transportation and the building. Are those likely to be cut just because the numbers are going to be cut across the board, or are those numbers actually based on we finish the production in the schools, we're getting bonds ready to be posted? Does that affect that at all, or just what they do?
Certain factors are accurate and others are not. So building aid, for example, I mean, looking at the governor's proposal, one thing that was in the governor's proposal, we're going to speak about one thing that was included in the governor's proposal was the misclassification of one of our capital projects, and he included a full aid reimbursement in the first year. As I mentioned earlier, that aid is typically spread out over a period of 10 to 15 years based on useful life. The executive proposal showed that we're going to get 100% of the aid, which is clearly not the case. So again, use extreme caution when you're looking at these things, because they're almost, I don't want to say entirely inaccurate, but they're clearly not completely accurate. And again, that's why we put a lot of time into reconciling Westar BOCES, because they are the experts in this field, and they assist us greatly in reconciling things like building aid and transportation.
I would add too, for transportation aid, as I said before, it's an expense-based aid. So what you spend 1 year, you get aided on the next year. We're not done with the 18-19 year. So it's a projection on what they think we're going to spend, but the year's not out.
Right.
So
that's a very good point.
So it's based on our averages of previous years, and they're just projecting out what they think we're going to spend.
Yeah, they do that for some of it's for data that Victor submitted back in the fall on what he was projecting for the year. But you don't know that early in the year. It's a kind of just like budgeting. It's it's a good guess, but you don't actually know till the year's out. But for excess cost aid, there's actually no bearing really in reality. They look back at your 2 prior years and they assign your highest of the 2. So it's some of it is a little deceptive, as Victor was pointing out. You really kind of need to hone it in to figure out what you're actually doing. And one other thing too I would say is that there is a political piece as well. The governor's showing the aid what he's projecting, but he knows he's not going to pay it all. So there's a piece there for his budgeting purpose on a statewide level. And he knows he's got a little bit more room to utilize it for other purposes.
So sort of a good cop, bad cop.
Most of bad.
And a good example of that, as Mike mentioned, so in last year's budget development, if you were to look at the executive proposal and the enacted budget, I think it showed that Brewster's building aid was going to increase something like 10%, some exorbitant number, because the state assumed that we were going to complete the renovation projects by last June. And again, they need to prepare for their worst case scenario, the fact that we may actually do that, and then they would have to pay us the building aid. Well, we knew that that project wasn't going to be complete and filed in time for that building aid to come in. So we had a large discrepancy between the amount that we're actually going to receive and the amount that the state says that we're going to receive, or the state's worst case scenario, what they might have to pay us. So oftentimes there is a disparity between what we're actually going to get, or what they say we're going to get, and what we actually receive, as evidenced by the past 4 years, of actual data. Sorry, you had another question?
I was going to say, it's also going to be a very interesting year because, even though the Democratic legislature now and a Democratic governor, his policies go against what the legislature wants, which is kind of going to be an even more intriguing political dynamic because, he's already faced a lot of flack for not offering to rectify the foundation. There was actually a protest a couple weekends ago led by Portchester, Rye, and Osley school districts who are actually in a worse situation than ours, same kind of deal. We're classified as urban suburban, and those are the districts that get crushed. Portchester with a huge immigration population just like ours, so it's going to be interesting to see if the Democratic legislature can take him down, where it's one of the things that he actually was in concert with the prior Republican legislature, because his policies are more Republican policy when it comes to education.
Yeah, it'll certainly be
I have a
interesting.
question. You said that we lost on the building because they thought we might have completed it. We were supposed to get that. Now, did we have a date that we were going to complete that? And if we did not get that money, will that carry over to this year because we didn't close out? So will we get the money next year?
Yes, it's never a loss in aid, it's deferred.
Okay.
So they assume that you're going, so the process is you submit a letter of intent to request to complete a project, then you need to get funding through a referendum vote, and then you submit scope documents to the commissioner, they approve it. They start a clock. They say that this project, in their minds, is going to be complete in a year and a half. So their expectation is that you're going to complete this project, file the final cost report, and the state is going to begin sending building aid to the district within a year and a half. And oftentimes that's not the case, because construction sometimes takes many years, especially just like we did, we phased it in over a number of years. So we had to back out of the state's projection, the amount that they assumed they were going to have to give us. But there is no loss in aid. Instead, it's just deferred for another year. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I was just curious because you said intent date. Did we have an intent date with the state?
No, it's the state's assumption.
Is there intent date?
Yeah, so again, their assumption is we're going to finish it within a year and a half of the date that it's submitted for approval.
In theory, it's actually a good practice by the state because they want to make sure that the money is available. However, I mean, they also know that not everyone's going to utilize it, so that's kind of they're using it for
They're
their
keeping a reserve to pay out there.
And I want to add one thing too, like the statewide kind of the political conversation right now. One thing that we don't know about, the governor put his budget out in the middle of January. Last week, I don't know if you saw it, but on the news, the governor had a press conference with the comptroller. And they haven't always been like the best of friends, believe it or not, this governor and a number of other people. But the fact that they sat down and said that there's actually a budget shortfall of $2.3 billion, I think it's significant and notable. We would hope that the enacted budget is going to give us more overall, particularly for districts, but we really, I think that's not a great sign.
So the indicators don't bode well for additional funding in the enacted budget.
Could be less though.
Right, and the governor, in the governor's budget, by law, he has 30 days to make any amendments to his budget. So 30 days would be the end of this week. So we haven't heard anything. We're in Albany, so we typically kind of hear things maybe a little before other parts of the state. We haven't really heard anything, but remains to be seen.
So now we're going to move on to tax cap, tax levy. So those two are actually two different things, and we often use them in the same respect, but they're actually two different things. So the tax cap is the maximum amount that the state allows that you can increase the tax levy. The tax levy is the actual amount that you increase the tax levy. So oftentimes the tax cap and the tax levy, or I should say sometimes, they're not actually the same number. So here's just a background of when the tax cap came into existence. The first year of implementation was in 2012, 2013. And over the past 7 years since the tax cap has been in play, the district's tax levy, the amount that they actually raised in taxes, has averaged just a 1.9% increase over the past 7 years. So it's been somewhat of a gift and a curse, because we've been accustomed to tax increases or tax levy increases of just 1.9% on average. But as we presented at the January 22nd board meeting, the two factors that are available to us in the tax cap at this moment have a tax cap increase of at least 3.6%, with other information becoming available later this month as we continue to reconcile with Westar BOCES. So again, I just want to make the distinction between tax cap, which is the state's formula, and tax levy, the actual amount that the district raises its taxes. So again, it is not a 2% tax. This is my obligatory opportunity here to say that it is not a 2% tax. 2% is just one factor in the formula that you'll see in a couple of slides. Every school district in New York State has its own tax cap formula. So in a given year, a district, say District A, could have a tax cap of 1%, and District B's tax cap could be 5%. If they both went out and levied 1% and 5% levy increases respectively, neither one of them would be considered going over the cap. So each district is unique. And looking back at last year, just in our region, in Putnam County, Westchester County, there were 11 school districts that had tax caps greater than 3%. All 11 went out with those tax levies greater than 3%. And all 11 received voter approval on those budgets. So again, it's not a 2% tax cap. Yes?
Just as a request for the Facebook users, when Mike speaks, can you just step a little bit closer to the screen?
Great.
So that way he's in the shot? Thanks.
Does anyone have any questions about this?
So where do the bonds fall? Because we owe like almost 60 million on top of that, so I just want to know where the bonds fall.
Getting to it. It's in the capital exclusion in a few slides. So just to give a little history, before the tax cap came into play, traditionally what would happen would be the superintendent would develop the educational instructional program for the district. The state would allocate state aid, and then the district would come up with the tax levy necessary to support the instructional program. After the tax cap, they kind of reversed the process. Instead, the state tells the district how much they can raise the taxes by virtue of the tax cap. The state provides an allowance of state aid, and then the district is forced to make reductions in order to meet the revenues, in order to meet the tax cap. So it's really reversed the process, whereas before it was what is the program that we want to promote for our students, and now it's what can we afford for our students. So getting into the different factors, the first factor is the tax base growth factor, and that is derived using a quantity change factor. It's reported by the local assessor's office up to the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance. It measures brick and mortar, new construction, or significant additions to existing properties, which increases the size of the tax base. So when there's an increase in the tax base growth factor, it's a good thing, because there's new assessments on the roll that are then diluting the tax levy and each other property owner's share of that tax levy. It can never be less than 0%. And as I mentioned, Brewster Central School District has no input or control over this information. Again, it's reported by the assessor's office to the New York State Department of Tax and Finance. Any questions with the tax base growth?
And that's going to be based on the Algonquin gas pipeline increase. That's going to be a factor in that.
That's a major factor affecting 1920's tax cap calculation. Is that major new addition, or it's I believe it's a new property that came on the assessment for 1920. So then you have the allowable growth factor, or the change in the consumer price index, CPI. The allowable growth factor, this is really where the tax cap gets its misnomer as a 2% tax cap, because it's limited to the lesser of 2% or the change in CPI. So for the year ended 2018, the consumer price index was actually about 2.4%. So for the purposes of our tax cap calculation, we can only use 2%. So that's where the 2% tax cap gets its name. Again, it can never be greater than 2%, and it can never be less than 0. And like the allowable growth factor, the school district has no input or control over this information either. It's derived from the federal government based on the CPI-U. Any questions with the allowable growth factor? The next factor is are any changes in pilot agreements. So pilot agreements are payments in lieu of taxes. They're negotiated between the Industrial Development Agency and commercial businesses on behalf of the towns, the villages, the schools, and the county, who are all affected proportionately for these arrangements. So expiring pilot agreements increase the tax cap because the property is now fully taxable. They go on the assessment roll and they're able to absorb that increase. A new pilot actually decreased the tax cap because the exempt portion is removed from the assessment, and instead the commercial business will pay directly to the town, the village, the school district, and the county an amount negotiated by the IDA. So because the property is excluded from the levy, it makes a separate payment according to the terms of the pilot, so therefore it decreases the tax cap. And you'll see in a couple of slides the impact of pilots that are both coming on and also expiring. Like the other two factors, the school district again has no input or control over this factor. Any questions with regard to pilots? So capital exclusions is where the debt of the district comes into play. So the capital exclusion is calculated based on the construction debt net of building aid. So again, we receive building aid, which is an offset of our debt, and that's the function of building aid. So an increase in the capital exclusion increases the tax cap. And the reason for this is because the voters already approved the increase through a separate referendum vote. So for example, back in, I want to say 2008, the voters approved the Wells Middle School renovation and addition project, which went to bond in 2016-17. And because the voters already authorized this project, the tax cap doesn't require a second request of approval for it, so it becomes an add-on, and you'll see that in a moment. A decrease in the capital exclusion actually decreases the tax cap because the debt is now paid off, so therefore there's no need to raise additional taxes to pay for that debt. And we do have limited input and control over this factor, but it's largely dependent on things that happened up to 10 or 15 years ago. Through effective long-range financial planning and community support for capital improvement projects, that's critical to stabilizing the capital exclusion. Any questions?
Why are you looking at me?
Well, because you asked about the debt. So,
I did have a question. Okay, so do you want to go there? You had said you always like to have one bond as we pay off one. Is that to stabilize that?
yes.
And what do we want to keep in as a range for this district?
Well, our right now, again, one of the challenges that we have, and we talked about this at our finance committee back in June. One of the challenges that we have is that we have building aid that was generated on a project, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, that the life of that building aid may not match the life of the bond associated with it. So for example, if we had a building aid that ended, say, last year, but the bond that it's associated with continues for another year, now we have a shortfall of revenue, right? Where in the past it was offsetting the expense of the bond. So we'll have a shortfall. The tax cap calculation allows an add-on to the tax cap to make up for the difference. So whenever there's a revenue shortfall because of building aid, it becomes an increase in the tax cap because the expense is still there. And again, the voters have already approved the expenditure. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So other exclusions, and these are very rare, would be a court order or a judgment in excess of 5% of our levy. Our levy for last year was about $74 million, so it would be an amount above $3.7 million. These are very rare. This has never happened, and hopefully will never happen. Increases in the ERS or TRS aggregate contribution rate, not the rate-to-rate change. So whenever we discuss the pension contributions, we talk about the rate-to-rate change because that's really what affects us. So if the ERS increases from say 13% to 15 or 16%, the aggregate rate increase is 3%, 16 minus 13. But the reality is that's like a 25% increase in the rate because it's really 3% divided by 13%. If that makes sense. So the tax cap does consider that, but they consider it in the wrong manner because a 3% increase in the aggregate rate is devastating. That being able to exclude that the difference really wouldn't benefit the district much. But it's available to us. Fortunately, it's only come into play once in the 12-13 year, where there was an aggregate rate increase of 2.6%.
Victor, maybe Mike can shed some light on why it's not been a favorable proposal to our governor to have a TRS reserve fund. So maybe you can speak to what you know about that.
Well, the governor, I think, is of the purview, and I think this is actually surprising that he agrees with the comptroller, is that their argument is districts have too many reserves. That's an opinion. And largely, you have reserves, and you're only able to have reserves. Every reserve, there's a legal definition for what you can have for specific purpose. And so I think the governor sees, he's often said to school districts, well, I'd give you more aid, but you have reserves. I mean, it's largely probably a political argument. So I think there's a reluctance to have more reserves. But I think it's when you think of fund balance, which is essentially a rainy day funds for a school district, you're only allowed to have 4% of your budget, where the municipalities can have a higher percent. I think they go up to 8%. So towns and villages and cities, they can have significantly more than school districts. So that's why schools use reserves, and oftentimes you're using them for a purpose that's really benefiting the taxpayers. And largely, you have those. They really are on the rainy day fund. And if you do have a major increase, as Victor said, it's not a small percentage increase in the retirement system. It's a significant amount year to year for a district. So the idea is really that's you're trying to plan for these events. But I think that's the governor's rationale, whether it's rightly correct assumption or that's his argument.
Is there any portion of New York State that's driving that belief more so than others?
I think what's happened the past several years, because things have improved overall statewide. And if you think of the pension system, it's largely going to be influenced by the stock market. So the stock market's doing well, and it's a 5-year average. So the stock market's doing well, you continue to do well. But what happens in this state is that the state is so the top 1% taxpayers make up 40% of the state revenue. That's Wall Street. So what happens is if Wall Street, if things go bad in Wall Street, you lose that revenue because you don't have bonuses, as high bonuses for the Wall Street. But then additionally, the pensions take a hit. And so it's like it's almost like a perfect storm. If things start to go bad, it can go really bad fast. So I don't think there's necessarily a particular part of the state that's driving it. But it's just in its nature, not just education, but the state as a whole is so reliant on Wall Street. And I think that's the governor, with some of the federal changes that we're seeing right now, and that's what he was attributing some of the state's downfall in revenues to. I think there is a little worry that kind of what's to come.
Can I have another question? You said we're allowed to have 4% reserves, and we have multiple reserves. Is that 4% per reserve, or is that for the entire budget, cumulative for all the reserves?
So the 4% is what's referred to as unappropriated fund balance. So that's just a savings account. There's no designated purpose. You have that, you need cash, you can reach in and use it. But it's not a whole lot of money all said and done.
And there's any other reserves?
Well, yeah, so there's additional reserves. I'm not sure of your particular reserves, but they're all for a specific function. Like there's a capital reserve where you can only pay for capital projects out of. There's a reserve for ERS, which would be all the non-instructional employees, but it doesn't help the school district very much because your primary cost is instruction, teachers. So your contribution to the teachers' retirement system is much more. So the reserves, there's you can have multiple reserves, but because the focus is so narrow, they don't always necessarily help you.
Thank you.
All right, so here we're taking a look at what's driving the tax cap increase, and we're just looking over the past 4 years. So as I mentioned, the construction debt for the Wells Middle School project, that debt was issued with the first bond payment being made in 1617. So you see here of the 4 different categories, green represents capital exclusions. In 1617 is when we made our first bond payment on that Wells Middle School project, which the project itself concluded, I want to say, at the end of the 2012 or 13 year, but that money was tied up in short-term bond anticipation notes. It was timing the extinguishment of building aid revenue, and it hit in 1617. Despite that, there was still an increase of some amount. And the purpose of this is to show the proportionate share of the impact on the tax levy. So you see here our tax levy increases over these 4 years have ranged from just 1.94 to 2.22. But the reason for the change is different in each year. So you see here again, the capital exclusion was the main component of the tax cap increase in 1617 and had a very minor impact on these other years. Pilot agreements, you see here, had a small increase in the tax cap. And again, this is because of the expiration of pilot agreements that became an add-on to the tax cap. Contrast that with 1819 when we had a new pilot agreement come on, which actually lowered the impact of the tax cap. So if not for this new pilot agreement, the tax cap in 1819 would have probably been closer to 2.75%. The allowable growth factor is the change in the consumer price index. You see in 1516 that would led to the majority of the increase in that year, and again in 1718 and also 1819. What happened in 1617 was that the Board of Education elected to not raise the full tax cap, and instead they levied an amount less than the tax cap. So therefore, the impact of the allowable growth factor was actually less than 0 because they levied an amount less than they were authorized to. Finally, the tax-based growth factor again measures brick and mortar additions in the tax base. This is new commercial businesses, new significant additions to commercial businesses, and they've had a pretty consistent impact on the tax cap, increasing it anywhere from what appears to be about a 0.3% increase to over 0.5% increase. And again, it's been pretty consistent over the past 4 years. However, again, as we discussed at the January 22nd board meeting, the tax-based growth factor entering the 1920 year is significantly higher, again, because of that Algonquin gas line new assessment. Does anyone have any questions with regard to this? Because this actually concludes our presentation for this evening. And I thank you all for coming, and I encourage you to continue to check back on our Budget 101 website, which has this presentation, all of the materials, Q&A documents, these videos, and really important things. And I do thank you for taking the time to come out to watch our Budget 101 workshops. And I thank Mike for coming down from Prestar
Thank you, Matt.
all the way from Albany to assist us this evening. Does anyone have any final questions, thoughts?
Thank
before
you.
we break?
Just one, quick, the overfunded districts, the lucky few, is there something standard that is why they're the overfunded district, or just totally random?
Sure, I can speak.
Yeah, please.
So if you think about that, if that foundation aid, if it was based on weighted enrollments, well, what are we seeing in a whole lot of the state?
Decrease.
Declining enrollments. And so particularly districts that have had a very dramatic decline in enrollment, every year they're getting an additional amount of aid, yet really if the formula were running, it would probably be significantly less because of those small enrollments.
Drastic population changes.
Yeah.
And that goes into reserves, so anything they don't spend, that goes into the reserves.
Well, he's speaking to just the foundation.
The foundation aid.
Yeah, so that's that calculation where Brewster's short 4 million, they could be to the good 4 million or even greater, just because that's the enrollment.
Sure. Is that why the Long Island districts were happy recently?
Well-
they're experiencing some increases.
But it's hard because we paint with a wide brush. We say Long Island, and certainly quite a few districts on Long Island are in that scenario where they're making out. But then you have some pockets of deep poverty where those districts are some of the most underfunded districts.
Instead, those.
Brentwood, I think it's a couple $100 million that they're shortly, and they've had an influx of ELL students and poor students, and so it's all out of whack. And we actually have a great tool on our website. If you sap.westar.org, it is our main website. There's a number of tools on there. It's public. You can take a look at it. But we have a foundation aid calculator where you can put a district's beds code in, and there's actually a tab that shows you what every district's beds code is, so you can look up neighboring districts. And a lot of times it's not what you think. You think, oh, well, they're wealthy or they're poor, and it's going to be one way or the other. And it's actually kind of surprising sometimes how they fall in relation to that. So what it largely says is the foundation formula is really broken from what it originally was.
Any other questions? Okay, and again, I thank you all for coming this evening. And please tell your friends, please refer back to the website. We'll be discussing the budget more in our board meetings for 1920.
Next few budget meetings, board meetings will be very specific to the 1920 school budget. Thank you all.
All right, thank you.
We're gonna be
Have
closed
a good
tomorrow.
evening.